So the topic of this address then is domestic violence, international human rights law, and the COVID-19 pandemic. So domestic violence affects vast numbers of people throughout all nations of the world, and it is now well recognised as constituting a health issue. However, since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, incidents of domestic abuse have increased dramatically around the world. The lockdown measures, which have been adopted by many states, including Ireland and the UK, although necessary to limit the spread of the virus, have nevertheless themselves been detrimental to the health of individuals, for example, in terms of the impact on mental health. In particular, those already living in abusive relationships have found themselves to be even more isolated and trapped in such situations, given the lockdown and social distancing measures which have been imposed. In addition, the widespread anxiety created by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of health concerns and also financial worries has increased tensions within many relationships, all too often resulting in violence. The increase in rates of domestic abuse has been so marked that UN Women, which is the UN entity dedicated to gender equality, has termed violence against women during the COVID-19 pandemic as being the shadow pandemic. So this address will examine the increase in instances of domestic abuse since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. It will then proceed to discuss domestic violence as an issue for international human rights law, and will then focus on the responses by UN entities such as the CEDAW Committee, UN Women, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, to the increased levels of domestic violence since the onset of COVID-19. In particular, the address will discuss the recommendations which have been made by such entities as regards the measures which should be adopted by governments to address domestic violence in the context of the pandemic. Studies carried out show that since the beginning of the pandemic, rates of domestic violence have increased dramatically around the world. For example, in France, reported cases of domestic abuse have increased by 30% since March of this year. In Argentina, emergency calls in relation to incidents of domestic violence have increased by 25%, also since March. And in Singapore and Cyprus, domestic violence helplines have registered increases in calls of 33% and 30% respectively. Increased rates of domestic violence and greater demand for emergency shelter provision have also been reported in the UK, the United States, Canada, Spain, and Germany. And in Ireland, organisations such as Women's Aid reported an increase in the number of calls to their helplines. And the Gardaí reported a 25% increase in domestic violence calls in April and May of 2020 as compared to April and May of 2019. Of course, domestic violence is caused by the actions of individual perpetrators, and the existence of the COVID-19 pandemic must in no way be seen to negate the responsibility of such perpetrators for their actions. However, the measures which have been adopted by governments around the world in order to limit the spread of COVID-19, although necessary, have nevertheless had the impact of exacerbating the suffering of those experiencing domestic abuse. The nature of domestic abuse is that it occurs behind closed doors. And in April 2020, around half of the world's population were in lockdown. Measures mandating that people should only leave their homes for purposes and severely limiting social contact meant that many victims of domestic violence were essentially trapped with their abusers with very little means of escape. In such circumstances, even the simple act of phoning or texting a friend for support, or indeed phoning a specialist support service, becomes more difficult or even impossible if both the victim and the perpetrator are at home together for almost all of the time. And according to Women's Aid, the number of referrals to refuges decreased by almost 40%, and the number of referrals to community-based services decreased by 16.5%. The situation was further exacerbated for victims who, due to pre-existing health conditions, were shielding from the virus and who could not therefore leave their homes at all. Indeed, such victims may have been in the position of being heavily reliant on their abusers in terms of purchasing food and collecting medication. It is common for perpetrators of domestic violence to attempt to isolate victims by cutting them off from friends and family. And with lockdown and social distancing measures, this was automatically affected without any effort on the part of perpetrators. According to a survey carried out by Women's Aid in April 2020, 67% of those currently experiencing abuse said that it had got worse since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and 76% said that they were having to spend more time with their abuser. 71% said that their abuser had a greater level of control over their life since COVID-19, and 78% said that the pandemic had made it more difficult for them to leave their abuser. In another survey carried out by Women's Aid in June 2020, 91% of those experiencing abuse said that the pandemic had affected their experiences of abuse in one or more ways. For example, 52% said they felt more afraid, and 58% said that they felt they had no one to turn to for help during lockdown. Some were reluctant to go to friends or family due to fears of spreading the virus, and 31% said that their friends or family could not help them because of lockdown restrictions. 40% said that they had not accessed any type of support since the beginning of the pandemic. 66% said that their abuser had used the pandemic as part of their abuse in one or more ways, such as, for example, refusing to take precautions to prevent the spread of the virus. And 10% said that they had attempted to leave, but their abuser had used the restrictions to prevent them from doing so, such as by threatening that they would be arrested for breaking the lockdown restrictions. Also, for some survivors who had experienced abuse in a previous relationship, isolation brought back feelings of being trapped and therefore affected their well-being and recovery. Over half of the respondents to the survey who had experienced abuse in the past said that the pandemic had triggered memories of abuse and affected their mental health. In addition, the stresses associated with both the pandemic itself in terms of health concerns and also the impact of lockdown and social distancing measures in terms of, for example, financial worries, have placed additional strains on relationships, which all too frequently have resulted in the occurrence of domestic violence. For example, in the survey carried out by Women's Aid in April 2020, 30% of those experiencing domestic abuse said that their abuser blamed them for the economic impact of COVID-19 on the household. The situation has been exacerbated by the fact that at the very time of rising rates of domestic violence, services available to victims were reduced, again due to lockdown and social distancing measures. This meant that, in effect, services were reduced at the time they were most needed. According to a survey carried out by Women's Aid of service providers, 84% said that they had had to reduce or cancel one or more services, with 36% of refuge providers having to do so. Also, 48% had been impacted by staff off work due to illness and 64% by staff unable to come into work as they were self-isolating. In addition, fundraising activities have been heavily curtailed due to the pandemic, and 68% of service providers who responded to the survey said that they were concerned about future loss of income from fundraising. Again, it must be stressed that neither COVID-19 nor the measures taken by governments to counteract it cause domestic violence. Until such times as the vaccine is widely rolled out, lockdown and social distancing measures are among the relatively few measures which governments have at their disposal to control the virus in an effective manner, and adherence to such measures is, of course, extremely important. Domestic violence is caused by individual perpetrators engaging in abuse, and neither COVID-19 nor the measures taken to control it should in any way be viewed as an excuse for such behaviour. Nevertheless, it remains a fact that lockdown and social distancing measures have created situations all around the world which have exacerbated the suffering of many victims of domestic violence, and which have formed the perfect storm for further relationships to become abusive. It seems that UN Women are correct in their assessment that violence against women, and indeed domestic violence against men also, is the shadow pandemic. Before discussing the responses of the UN bodies to the increase in cases of domestic abuse since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I just want to talk about domestic violence as an issue for international human rights law more generally. It is only relatively recently that domestic violence began to be regarded as an issue for international human rights law. The main problem in this respect was found in the way in which rights themselves were formulated. Essentially, international law has its basis in the liberal social contract theory, whereby states are viewed as individuals which should have equality, independence, and freedom. Inherent to this theory is the concept of negative rights ensuring individual freedom. This idea is therefore embedded deeply in the discourse of international law and subsequently human rights law. Essentially, the concept of negative rights means that the state cannot interfere with an individual in certain aspects of her or his life. Another main principle of international law is that, in general, only states can be subject to this body of law. Human rights therefore evolved to protect the rights of the individual from encroachment by the state, and the rights norms which emerged were generally formulated in a negative way, whereby the state was obliged only to refrain from breaching the rights in question. There were no duties on the state to adopt positive measures to ensure that the rights of the individual were not violated. In addition, the state was not obliged to protect the rights of the individual from violation from another private party. Rights, therefore, developed in such a way as to create a public-private divide by which human rights norms were upheld in the public sphere where the state was involved, but were not applied in the private sphere. However, the public-private divide does not now pose an insurmountable problem as regards the recognition of domestic violence as an issue for human rights law. Various ways have been developed in which human rights may now enter into the private sphere. In particular, the concept of state responsibility has been developed, under which positive obligations can be placed directly on the state to ensure that human rights standards are upheld in situations involving only private individuals. For example, the United Nations human rights bodies frequently refer to the state's duties to respect, protect, promote and fulfil rights. At the regional level, the judicial branches of both the Inter-American and Council of Europe systems have been extremely instrumental in developing the concepts of state responsibility and positive obligations. In the context of the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights has used the doctrine of positive obligations in a particularly effective manner in order to overcome the problems which were once posed by the public-private divide. In certain circumstances, positive obligations can be placed on states to protect the rights of individuals from threats posed by other private parties. The positive duties which may be placed on states parties are wide-ranging. None of the UN human rights treaties make any express reference to domestic violence. However, the UN human rights bodies have now brought the issue of domestic violence within their scope through the use of provisions such as the right to life, the right not to be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, the right to equality, the right to be free from all forms of discrimination, the right to liberty and security of person, the right to equal protection under the law, and the right to the highest standard attainable of physical and mental health. Various categories of recommendations have been made to states as regards their responses to domestic violence. These include the adoption of measures relating to improving their criminal justice, improving measures of civil protection, providing social support measures to victims, increasing awareness within society regarding issues surrounding domestic violence, increasing awareness of professionals who may be particularly likely to come into contact with victims, and developing programs for perpetrators. Instruments which are relevant to the issue of domestic violence include the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, resolutions of the UN General Assembly, including the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and reports of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. Of these instruments, in strict legal terms, only CEDAW is binding on states. However, it is important to note that this instrument contains no express mention of domestic violence or indeed violence against women more generally within its provisions. At first glance, the omission of gender-based violence from a treaty which focuses on the rights of women may seem somewhat surprising. However, this omission can be explained by the fact that CEDAW was adopted in 1979, and it was only in the 1970s that domestic violence began to be viewed as an issue which merited the attention of any form of law, let alone international human rights law. However, in 1992, the CEDAW Committee issued its General Recommendation number 19. This was an immensely important development, as this General Recommendation officially interpreted CEDAW as prohibiting violence against women in both the public and private contexts. In addition, it is worth noting that the CEDAW Committee has now considered a number of complaints regarding the responses of states to domestic violence which have been taken under the optional protocol procedure. The optional protocol to CEDAW, which entered into force in December 2000, allows individuals or groups to submit claims of violations of the Convention to the CEDAW Committee. Following the World Conference on Human Rights, which was held in Vienna in 1993, a special rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and consequences, was appointed by the UN Commission on Human Rights. And it has been remarked that the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has brought international consciousness to a new level. The UN General Assembly has also made recommendations relating to states' responses to domestic violence, and in 1993 the General Assembly issued its important declaration on the elimination of violence against women, known as DEVO. The growing recognition of domestic violence as constituting an issue for human rights law is not, of course, confined to the UN system. With the adoption of the Convention on the Preventing and Combating of Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, known as the Istanbul Convention, in 2011, the Council of Europe has taken the important step of adopting a legally binding instrument which addresses the issue of violence against women. This convention entered into force in 2014. Ireland is a party to this instrument, and the UK has signed but not yet ratified this treaty. However, the Council of Europe is not the first of the regional human rights systems to adopt such an instrument. Indeed, almost 17 years prior to the Council of Europe's adoption of the Istanbul Convention, the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment and Eradication of Violence Against Women, also known as the Convention of Belém do Pará, was adopted by the General Assembly of the Organization of American States. This instrument was certainly a pioneering development, given that it constituted the first regional instrument which addressed the issue of violence against women. In addition, the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, also known as the Maputo Protocol, was adopted by the African Union in 2003, although it is important to note that the Maputo Protocol is not focused solely on violence against women. Instead, it covers a wide range of rights encompassing civil and political rights, economic, social and cultural rights, and group rights. So, what is the response of the UN agencies to the increase in domestic violence since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, in March 2020, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women issued a statement on domestic violence in the context of COVID-19 lockdowns. In this statement, she commented that for too many women and children, home can be a place of fear and abuse. That situation worsens considerably in cases of isolation, such as the lockdowns imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. She proceeded to say that all states should make significant efforts to address the COVID-19 threat, but they should not leave behind women and children victims of domestic violence, as this could lead to an increase of domestic violence, including intimate partner femicides. The Special Rapporteur also stated that the risk is aggravated in a time where there are no or fewer shelters and help services available for victims, when it is difficult to access those that are still open, and when there is less community support, fewer police interventions and less access to justice as many courts are closed. And that, to make matters worse, restrictions of movement, financial constraints and generalised uncertainty embolden perpetrators and provide them with additional power and control. It certainly seems that the Special Rapporteur's predictions have indeed come to fruition. The Special Rapporteur called upon governments not to put the protection of victims on hold and urged them to continue to combat domestic violence in the time of COVID-19. She proceeded to state that measures to protect victims must remain available or be adopted during the crisis that this included ensuring access to protection by restraining orders and maintaining safe shelters and helplines for victims. The Special Rapporteur commented that, as making phone calls might be dangerous in a context of home confinement, helplines can facilitate access by providing online chats and texting services for victims. States should also come up with new and creative solutions to support them. And she concluded that governments must not allow the extraordinary circumstances and restrictive measures against COVID-19 to lead to the violation of women's rights to a life free from violence. The Special Rapporteur also called for submissions on the increase of domestic violence in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic from civil society, states, national human rights institutions, international organisations, academia and other stakeholders. Recently, in October 2020, the Special Rapporteur presented a report to the UN General Assembly in which she stated that the COVID-19 pandemic must not be a barrier to eliminating violence against women as a pandemic of women's human rights violations. States should uphold their human rights obligation to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence, and that states should ensure that restrictive measures and imposed home confinement do not have the intended consequence of enabling and increasing violence against women and domestic violence at home. In April 2020, the UN Secretary-General called for measures to address what he termed a horrifying global surge in domestic violence connected to lockdowns imposed by governments responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. He pointed out that for many, the threat looms largest where they should be safest, in their own homes, and he proceeded to make a number of recommendations to states. These included increasing investment in online services, declaring shelters as essential services, creating safe ways for victims to seek support without alerting their abusers, avoiding the release of prisoners convicted of violence against women, and scaling up public awareness campaigns. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Committee, has issued a guidance note on CEDAW and COVID-19 in which it states that during confinement, women and girls are at increased risk of domestic, sexual, economic, psychological and other forms of violence against women. They said that national response plans to COVID-19 should prioritise availability of safe shelters, hotlines and remote psychological counselling services. States parties should develop protocols for the care of women not admitted to such services due to their exposure to COVID-19, which includes safe quarantine and access to testing. Given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures taken to control it on levels of domestic abuse, UN Women has made a range of recommendations to governments and civil society organisations. These recommendations relate to violence against women more broadly, rather than being focused solely on domestic violence. However, they are generally very applicable to domestic violence. Also, it should be noted that the UN agencies generally view the issue of domestic violence as simply a subcategory of violence against women, and this is reflected in the language of the recommendations. However, very importantly, it must be remembered that men also can experience domestic abuse. Firstly, it is recommended that governments allocate resources to address violence against women in COVID-19 national action plans. Services for women who have experienced violence should be treated as essential services, and it is recommended that the capacity of shelters should be expanded, including repurposing other spaces such as empty hotels or education institutions to accommodate quarantine and social distancing requirements. Also, helplines and online counselling should be strengthened. UN Women also recommends the adoption of measures to raise awareness among the police and the judiciary regarding the increase of violence against women during COVID-19, and to provide training on how to respond, protect and refer victims and survivors to appropriate services. Support for grassroots organisations should be ensured, particularly those that provide essential services to hard-to-reach, remote or vulnerable populations. It's also recommended that data should be collected on the incidence of violence against women, including domestic violence. UN Women has also made a number of recommendations to civil society groups, such as building strong advocacy and awareness regarding increased violence against women during COVID-19, proactively challenging gender stereotypes accentuated under COVID-19 circumstances, such as increased household care work for women, with targeted messages for men in order to encourage healthy ways of coping with stressful situations, and engaging with media outlets to continue to raise the visibility of increased violence against women. So, to sum up, the COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented situation which has caused intractable problems for governments worldwide. It is true that until a vaccine is widely rolled out, at the most basic level, the most effective way of preventing the spread of a contagious virus is to keep people apart as much as possible. In the absence of interaction, the virus cannot be transmitted. This is, of course, the premise behind the lockdown and social distancing measures which have been implemented. Essentially, the most effective way to protect oneself from COVID-19 is to remain at home as much as possible and only leave home when it is essential to do so. For the majority, home is therefore the safest place, certainly in the context of COVID-19. However, the paradox for those experiencing domestic violence is that while home may be the safest place to be as regards COVID-19, it is conversely the most dangerous place in relation to the shadow pandemic of domestic abuse. Again, it must be emphasised that domestic violence is caused by the behaviour of individual perpetrators, and lockdown measures cannot negate the responsibility of individual perpetrators for their actions. However, lockdown and social distancing measures do serve to create conditions which facilitate the occurrence of domestic violence in terms of isolation of victims from social sources of support and limiting means of escape from such violence situations. This is a problem to which there are no easy solutions. Bodies such as the UN entities have certainly put forward a number of very meritorious recommendations. However, even if these were all to be implemented by governments, it is still unlikely that the impact of lockdown and social distancing measures on rates of domestic violence would be entirely negated. The COVID-19 pandemic is a health issue in ways which go beyond cases of the virus itself, and it is likely to remain so until such times as a vaccine is widely rolled out. Thank you very much. So I'm just looking at the chat function here, and I see that Gillian has put on a question here. So I'll just sort of take a second just to read the question. Yeah. Yes, so Gillian here has asked about whether the current context could be perhaps an opportunity to take a step forward to fix some of the existing problems, sort of the pre-existing problems in the realm of domestic violence. Yes, and I think that is certainly a valid point there, and it could indeed be an opportunity. Some of the pre-existing problems, of course, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were certainly major problems with responses to domestic abuse, and this applies really to states all around the world. And I think certainly what COVID-19 has done in relation to domestic abuse has drawn further attention to the issue. I mean, there have been media reports which have highlighted the dramatic increase in cases of domestic abuse during the pandemic. And I think that has served to highlight the issue of domestic abuse more generally. And a lot of the recommendations which have been made by the UN bodies that I've talked about, they would of course be helpful even with COVID-19 taken out of the equation. So, things like ensuring greater access to refuge facilities and ensuring greater attention being paid to implementing public awareness campaigns and so on, and increased funding, of course, for domestic violence service providers, which is a big issue. I mean, those are all things which could serve to help the situation even after the COVID-19 crisis has passed. So yes, I think that is a very good point. And I think, yes, the attention that has been paid to domestic abuse in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic may indeed have a lasting impact, perhaps, in terms of improving the situation for victims of domestic violence in the long run, potentially. Yeah. So thank you for your question, Gillian.
Thanks very much, Gillian. We have another question.
Yes, so yes, Ruth there says, what are your views on the new bill regarding domestic violence in terms of COVID-19? Do you think it tackles awareness of domestic violence? Yes, so the new bill as regards domestic violence, so just in case anybody's not aware, there is currently legislation going through Stormont in terms of domestic violence in relation to Northern Ireland. And I think certainly it's a very important piece of legislation, absolutely, and it's certainly very positive that it is currently going through the Assembly. And one of the things that it does is that, or it would do if it were to be enacted, is that it creates an offence of domestic violence, and it essentially criminalises coercive control, which is of course already criminalised in other parts of the UK, in Scotland, England and Wales, and in the Republic of Ireland. So I think certainly from that perspective, the bill is a very meritorious development, definitely. I suppose we should perhaps be cautious in terms of treating the domestic abuse bill as a kind of a silver bullet which will solve all problems in relation to domestic abuse. I don't know if some of you may have seen, there's an article that my colleague Dr. Rachel Keeling has put on QPOL, and Rachel in that article focuses on this and the fact that there will still be problems with domestic abuse even after this bill is passed, well, assuming that it is passed, of course, because for example, in relation to coercive control, in England and Wales, it has been identified that there have been issues in terms of collecting evidence to prosecute in cases of coercive control, because it can be difficult to collect sufficient evidence in such cases. So even if, assuming the bill is enacted into legislation, it's still very important that other approaches to domestic violence are not forgotten about. And as Rachel has mentioned in her piece, it's important that we still try to take a holistic approach to addressing the issue of domestic abuse. So yes, so while I think the bill is certainly a very meritorious development, it is just still important to be cautious about seeing it as an absolute panacea to domestic abuse. Yes, sorry, I just see Elizabeth here has put a question on the chat function. Let me just take a minute to read it regarding potential long-term impacts. Yeah, future financial concern. Yeah, absolutely, Elizabeth, that's a very good point. So Elizabeth here is asking about the long-term impacts of the pandemic and the impact that those can have and may have on domestic abuse, such as future financial concerns. And yeah, absolutely, you're quite right, Elizabeth. I mean, it is important to remember that even after the vaccine is rolled out, that's not the end of the crisis as such, because we've been told that financial concerns will last longer than, you know, when a vaccine is actually rolled out in its entirety. And so those longer term impacts, for example, the impact on people's jobs, on their financial security, on their incomes, those will outlast the actual health impact of the pandemic. And indeed, those financial concerns can, as Elizabeth says here, create a toxic environment or create an environment for toxic relationships to develop. And that's very true. So the increase in rates of domestic violence may outlast the actual health pandemic itself, and it is very important that those long-term impacts are also borne in mind. So yes, so again, that's a very good point, Elizabeth. Thank you for that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to, I suppose, somewhat abuse my position as chair by asking a question myself, if you don't mind. I just wondered, like, first of all, what your thoughts were, but also where you see it going in terms of the pandemic has led to a lot of resources being stretched thin, and with increasing demand on shelters, and increasing demand on public services generally. And I mean, we've had almost a year of listening to people saying our resources are stretched thin, our resources are stretched thin. So what kind of harm, what kind of long-term harm is that doing to the sort of structures of domestic violence prevention, or not even just prevention, but the ability to address it within police, within the criminal justice system, within even NGOs that actually deal with violence against women?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Anurag. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, within the context of the pandemic, resources are certainly being stretched, and in terms of state resources, huge amounts of money have been poured into actually addressing the health consequences of the pandemic. Huge amounts of resources have gone into the NHS, into buying PPE, and of course into the development of the vaccines and into the purchasing of the vaccines. And that's of course all essential. That's all extremely important. But you're quite right. All the resources that have gone into those kinds of things, I mean, it leaves fewer resources for other areas. And I think that could indeed have long-term impacts for services that do provide support for victims of domestic abuse. And even beyond state resources, I mean, charities that provide services for victims of domestic abuse, which are extremely important. They have reported that there's severe restrictions on their funding activities. So like fundraising in the charitable sector has been curtailed immensely due to a lockdown and social distancing requirements. And, again, I mean, they are concerned about their long-term impact. And I think it will take a very long time before full recovery is made in those areas. I mean, it's still quite a long way off until such charitable organisations can begin their full fundraising activities again. So there's long-term impacts there. So absolutely, you are quite right. I mean, these are not things that will come to an end. These problems will not, they don't have short-term solutions. They are difficulties that will stretch far into the future, and they are real problems, real intractable difficulties to which it is very hard to find holistic solutions, really.
Thanks very much. We have...
Yes, so I'm just seeing here Gillian's question here. Okay, so provision of mental health support in primary school. So yes, so Gillian's asking here about the long-term mental health impacts for children who witness domestic violence in the home, particularly when schools were closed during the pandemic, and the need for additional support in the future, and about the provision of mental health support in primary schools. And yes, I mean, Gillian, you raise a really important issue there. I mean, domestic abuse can have very long-term impacts on the mental health of children who witness it. And sometimes children can be the forgotten victims of domestic abuse, because it is, of course, extremely distressing for a child to witness domestic abuse between their parents. And the mental health impact of that cannot be underestimated. And I think certainly that is something that should be focused on in the future, because of course, as you say, Gillian, when schools were closed, I mean, obviously children were at home for all of that time, and that means that cases in which there were situations of abuse in their homes, children would have been exposed to witnessing such abuse. And I mean, which is incredibly traumatic for children. And so I think, yes, the provision of mental health support in primary schools would indeed be beneficial, absolutely. And yes, I think that is something that would certainly be meritorious in the future. And it is essential that, you know, children who witness domestic abuse in their homes, they should not be the forgotten victims in all of this. It is very important to remember the traumatic impact on children of witnessing domestic abuse between their parents, absolutely. So yeah, it's a very good point, Gillian. Thank you for that.
Thanks very much. We have